The ANC this week suspended former President Jacob Zuma as a party member. Since last year, Zuma has been campaigning for the newly formed Umkhonto weSizwe party. Joining us to look at the implications of Zuma's suspension during election season is Professor Sethulego Matebesi from the Sociology Department at the University of the Free State and Pranish Desai, data analyst at Good Governance Africa. Gentlemen, good afternoon. Appreciate your time. Prof, allow me to start off with you, and let's focus on the specific actions or events that led to the ANC National Executive Committee's decision to suspend former President Jacob Zuma. I mean, we had assumed that the suspension would have come in a little while ago. It's been some time since he publicly declared that he would not be supporting the ANC, but would in turn be supporting the Umkhonto weSizwe party.
Hi, good afternoon, Hugo, and good afternoon to the viewers. A very valid question. But look, I strongly believe that this has become part of the DNA of the African National Congress, where they will dilly-dally around taking a decision where they had to show and demonstrate not only to party members, but to South Africans, that indeed the African National Congress is a leader in society by taking decisive action, irrespective of whether it is Zuma or anybody else, but they're taking a stance on such pronouncements, which I strongly believe that pronouncements from Jacob Zuma, that I strongly believe that would have created, and it already has created, the perception that it seems as if there are untouchables within the African National Congress.
Now, I'm glad you raised that issue, and Pranish, I'd like you to come in there. Professor raised the issue of some individuals being more equal than others, so to speak. Now, when it comes to governance issues, what are the sort of problems that arise from treating members of the same establishment with different applications of the rule book, if you will?
Good afternoon, Hugo, and good afternoon to the professor and, your viewers out there. Thanks, Hugo. That's an excellent question. In fact, just this week, I've written about this for GJ in the Mail and Guardian about how, one of the problems with South Africa at the moment is this disconnect where many people are feeling detached from the democracy. Increasing people in surveys, and if you just talk to them regularly, are saying that, we're very unhappy about the direction and we're very dissatisfied with the way democracy is currently operating. And a core driver of that, in my view, is the fact that there is this perception that there's one rule for the powerful and one rule for the ordinary. And that's never good in a democratic society, especially one that, was gone through a unique struggle such as our own. And it is very worrying when, this perception that citizens have that there is a dual-track set of rules, one for the powerful and one for the rest, that view is entrenched, and it's also equally worrying when they see, that there's very little prosecution taking place for people who are complicit in things like state capture, among other things.
Now, Professor, there have been accusations that for more than 2 decades, Zuma's interests have been accommodated over those of the country and the ANC. What some of these examples be, and how has it impacted on perceptions of the ANC, one from outsiders, and obviously the interests of ANC members internally?
Well, Hugo, before answering that question, perhaps very briefly, I would like to say, if you look at what the political history of South Africa has offered us, despite what we understand about the former President Jacob Zuma, is that there is another profoundly significant dimension about the way he operates. And that is the ability to regularly foster unconstructive dialogue. And I think that in itself is to demonstrate that he is untouchable. But for me, there's several examples. And very surprisingly, the current Secretary General of the African National Congress has actually publicly accepted that the African National Congress subscribed to this notion that if you scratch my back, I will also scratch your back. And it's exactly what they've done. And unfortunately, this conundrum has become so entrenched within the operations of the African National Congress that certain leaders has actually decided, to eliminate other political leaders. If you look at the political killings in KwaZulu-Natal, but for me, several examples. The Nkandla scandal, very unacceptable in any other part of the world, any democracy. Action would have been taken against the former leader, president of the country, but also many other shenanigans. And unfortunately, it is ordinary South Africans that will pay the price of certain decisions, or sometimes even lack of taking, the political will to implement what I would say basic rules and regulations. Because remember, many of these leaders are serving also in our public services. And this vicious cycle of moving one individual and taking him or her to another part of the country, that has huge implications. And it's the same. I mean, the environment has been so conducive for Jacob Zuma that he still believes that he can say what he wants and he can behave in a way that he wants and there will be no consequences. And it is even very surprising that you have got a former president of the country behaving in this way. And I strongly believe that there should have been, the people around the former president is also much to be blamed, because there is a huge responsibility beyond the African National Congress, and that is to demonstrate that not all African leaders can be, assessed within the same basket. But unfortunately, yet once again, we have been, it has been demonstrated that it seems as if our African leaders do not subscribe to the whole notion that we have to respect democratic principles.
Now, Pranish, Professor touches on a couple of issues, and one of those issues is that Jacob Zuma seems to have this untouchable, seems to be an enigma of sorts within the ANC, and this suspension almost affirms that, if you will. Surely they could have acted sooner. Two, one would suggest that there is a fear of the implications of expulsion, right? And it's the party thinking of itself, I suppose, to some degree, in terms of not expelling Jacob Zuma. But I also want to bring in the issues around many of the members of the ANC that have been accused of various issues around corruption. And I want to look at the function of the Integrity Committee within the ANC, which speaks about upholding the highest standards of rigor and integrity in all aspects of the organization. But how much of that is clear in their dealings with the various members of the ANC?
Thanks, Hugo. So one of the first answers that the professor gave around how the fact that the ANC is increasingly a very slow-moving organization is especially salient. And we've seen it in this case, and we've seen it in dozens of cases before this, whether they're linked to corruption or just general policy issues. As it relates to the work of the ANC Integrity Committee, or, the role that the ANC has tried to play in terms of what it's somewhat defined as a sort of internal cleansing exercise over the past few years with things like the step-aside rule, it's pretty clear that even there, there has been a double standard that has been created. Quite often the most powerful and most well-connected ANC members are not the ones who are punished by it. And, that again creates an internal perception within the ANC that, so long as I'm high up enough, perhaps I won't actually face any consequences, whether it's within the party or, within the legal system as a whole. And that is very concerning, because it does create a culture where there's a lack of accountability. And that's very worrying for a number of reasons, not least the fact that, people are just generally pessimistic about the country as a whole. And instances like this involving, a former president who has a number of scandals over his head, but still seems to have a degree of impunity, merely, perpetuate that idea in people's heads.
Now, Professor, ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula mentioned the potential danger of violence erupting during the elections. What might be the source of that line of thinking, and how much of it is attributable to Jacob Zuma, if at all?
Well, yet once again, I mean, if you look at a couple of months before each elections, there are flashes of violence, sporadic protests throughout South Africa, because South Africans, just a couple of weeks or months before the elections, believe that they now have the bargaining power to perhaps force government to come to the party or to the negotiating table. So that is one factor. But based on what has been experienced, with the July under of 2021, I think the Secretary General may just believe that some members of MK and even other political parties, because already here in the Free State we've seen clashes between ex-supporters and the ANC here in the Welkom region. So perhaps that gives us a glimpse of what we can expect during the election. But that would be unfortunate. Because I strongly believe that after 30 years of democracy, or almost 3 decades, South Africans should actually celebrate such a fundamental activity that is aimed at consolidating our democracy, and that is the elections. And I strongly believe that some leaders actually thrive on such chaotic situation. But yet once again, generally, that would be very unfortunate if we are going to experience many acts of violence around election campaigning and all that.
Pranish, Zuma's suspension, according to some sources, might have come too late to diffuse the full impact of his last defiant stand. Any consequences or outcomes that might be anticipated from this? Has he already moved, so to speak? Has he moved the needle, do you think?
I think that in the electoral sense, we'll simply just have to wait and see. It is quite clear that former President Zuma does have, some degree of support publicly, especially located in certain provinces like KwaZulu-Natal and perhaps areas within Gauteng. But what's a lot less clear is that he's not the actual candidate standing for office, and he will not be. Whether that popularity is transferable to a very new party. That's still something that we'll have to see as campaign season, heats up. In terms of the longer term view, the suspension won't change the trajectory of what has been, quite negative trajectory as it is specifically dealing with corruption issues over the last 10 to 15 years, around dealing with the sort of issues that the professor mentioned about, certain individuals preferring a system of chaos rather than, one wherein the full democratic rights of South Africans and the rule of law is respected. So in that sense, the longer-term consequences won't be changed by the fact of, the suspension. And in terms of the short-term electoral state of gameplay, that's something that we'll just have to see as time develops.
Professor Sethulego Matebesi from the Sociology Department to the University of the Free State, and Pranish Desai, data analyst at Good Governance Africa. Appreciate your time, that conversation on